Hello everyone, welcome to English for You. I'm Mike.
And I'm Sam.
And today we are in day 2 of our look at the Great White Way, the famous Broadway Avenue in New York City, New York. In America, of course, this is where people go to have a really good time watching plays, musicals, all sorts of shows like that. So you said you haven't been to Broadway.
No, I haven't been to New York.
But you've been to London, you've been to
London.
the West End.
I have.
Okay.
Once or twice, yes.
All right. And you saw some good shows there, I'm sure.
Yes, I did. Yes, but of course in New York, in Manhattan, on Broadway, but Broadway isn't the only place in the Manhattan district to see theatre.
Exactly. We talked all about Broadway, gave you some of the history and mentioned some of the really famous shows that you can see there even now, even today. A lot of those shows are still on, but if that's not really your cup of tea, if seeing The Lion King, or I've seen it, or I don't really like that kind of show, I want to see something newer, something a little more interesting, maybe a little more exciting. There are definitely shows for you, but maybe not on Broadway. No. Maybe you'll have to go Off-Broadway.
Right.
This is a real place, so we're going to be reading about it today. Yeah.
Reading.
New York's Theater District, Broadway and beyond. Broadway isn't the only game in town. The Off-Broadway movement began in the 1950s as a rejection of Broadway shows' commercialism and expensive ticket prices. Off-Broadway productions were a way for playwrights and actors to try out shows with smaller casts and stage crews. Off-Broadway became known for more experimental and less expensive shows than Broadway. You can find dozens of off-Broadway theaters near the Broadway district. These have between 100 and 499 seats. Many playhouses that are now off-Broadway theaters used to be theaters for live vaudeville and variety shows. These faded because they couldn't compete with the new media of film and television. The oldest off-Broadway theater still operating is the Cherry Lane Theater. The Obie Awards honor the best off-Broadway plays and musicals. Two famous off-Broadway shows include Blue Man Group and I Love You, You're Perfect. Now change. The longest-running musical in theater history, The Fantastics, ran off-Broadway for over 42 years. Some popular off-Broadway shows later moved to Broadway. These include Grease, A Chorus Line, Rent, and Hamilton.
So, our Day 2 article starts with Broadway isn't the only game in town. Okay. So what is only game in town? Are we talking about games? We seem to be talking about theatres. Why are we talking about games?
Maybe, but I don't think it's quite the same.
No.
And certainly it's not about the theater, because a game is a sport usually. Theaters aren't games. They're performances or plays or something.
Right. So what does this phrase mean? Well, it's a bit of a funny phrase, as we said, nothing to do with games.
Okay.
Instead, it means that something is the only one of its kind available. Okay. So in New York, Broadway isn't the only theatre district. So you can go to watch a play somewhere else if you like. So the only district available, not the only game available. Other places you can go.
Okay, maybe it's not the most famous one, the most well-known one, but we do have options. We do have choices. It's not the only game in town. There are others that are similar that you might want to check out because maybe you'll like them more. So what other kinds of shows and where else can you see these shows in New York? It says the off-Broadway movement began in the 1950s as a rejection of Broadway shows' commercialism and expensive ticket prices. So you can kind of think of off-Broadway kind of like an independent film or a movie that gets made for a small amount of money and put on Netflix. And this is really different from, Marvel movies, Star Wars movies, Fast and Furious movies. Those are the big commercial movies, the ones that, maybe aren't the most interesting, but will still entertain you. But if you're looking for something different, Off-Broadway is like an independent movie, and sometimes these are a rejection of kind of the common, popular thing that might make a lot of money, but might be boring to a certain kind of person.
Rejection is the noun form of the verb reject. When we reject something, we don't agree to accept it or support it. Essentially, we are saying no to the idea. For example, a store manager might say to the company boss that he wants to increase the price of their TVs that they're selling. However, his boss rejects the idea because he thinks no one will buy TVs that are too expensive. The boss said no to the store manager. He made a rejection. Here's another example, this time with the noun form rejection. The company's rejection of giving its employees extra vacation days made the employees angry. The company didn't like the idea of giving extra vacation days, so it refused or rejected. It said no. This made the employees very unhappy.
And there, in this case, Off-Broadway was rejecting, it was a rejection of the commercialism of your typical big Broadway show.
Right. And commercialism is a big word.
It is a big word.
Yeah.
It's about big money.
It is. Yeah, so we use commercialism to talk about things, usually businesses, that are about making profits, like making money, like you said. It's often used negatively, though, not always, but often, to mean that the money making comes above everything else. So maybe it comes above quality products or good customer service. So maybe a Broadway theatre, it's usually a good production, but it's mostly there to make money.
Yeah, exactly. If you're the kind of person who doesn't like to eat at the big chain fast food restaurants because you don't want to make McDonald's richer than they are, you find little restaurants with local cooks. That's the kind of thing you're doing. You're rejecting the big businesses to try to help out the little guy.
Right. So now we might see how Off-Broadway began. Let's find out. So the article says, Off-Broadway productions were a way for playwrights and actors to try out shows with smaller casts and stage crews.
Good idea.
Yeah, you might want to give something a go before putting it into a full Broadway production.
For sure. And those big Broadway shows, they cost a lot of money. And so you don't want to have a show that's not popular. You can try it out on a smaller scale off-Broadway. Very smart.
Yeah. So who are these playwrights? Well, we previously had the word playhouse to mean a theatre. Okay. This time we have the word playwright to mean someone who writes plays. So play and write are joined together to form this easy to remember compound word, playwright.
There you go. It's very useful. And also, W-R-I-G-H-T, right? That also means to make something.
Right, it does.
Interesting.
Yes.
So you're making plays or you're writing plays. You're a play author. No, you're a playwright.
Playwright.
Okay, cool.
And we also have the phrase try out. So in this article, the phrase to try out means to test something. Give something a go to see if it works well. So in the article, playwrights and actors can test their shows in an easier, cheaper setting to see if they work before making them bigger.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah, you'll try out something like a new pair of shoes before you buy it. You'll try out a car or a bicycle by driving it around before you pay for it. And artists like to try out things, right?
Yes, they do.
A musician might try out a new song in front of their friends or a small audience.
Yeah.
People say, great, then they know they're onto something good. If they go, ugh, they'll know they'll have to go back and work on that song a little bit longer. And we also have this word cast, a very important word when talking about plays and shows and musicals and things like that. Yeah, as I mentioned, cast is an important word when talking about a show or a play because the cast is the group of people who are acting in the show. They are on screen, on stage, they are playing characters, they are telling the story. And yeah, we would use this for anything from an opera to a musical to a television show to a movie, anything like that. And even if you are in your high school play, you are in the cast, as long as you're on stage acting and performing. If you're helping backstage, if you're doing hair and makeup, costumes, doing the lights, decorating the stage or things like that, that would be the crew. So basically the whole team of people would be the cast, the actors, the crew, the people who make the show possible by doing all the other jobs. For example, many of the young actors in the cast of that old war movie are famous Hollywood stars now. And how convenient our next word is crew. The other word that I mentioned there, a crew, these are people who probably have skills that they do with their hands. Right. A crew, though, is basically just a team of workers. But as I said, a crew will probably be building things, lifting things, moving things, setting things up. Not just in a play, you could have a pit crew in a Formula One team.
Yes.
They're the guys who change the tires and fix the car.
Gas in.
All that kind of stuff. And of course, you'd have a crew on almost any job, a construction crew, the men and women up there building the building. Or here's another one. If you look out of the window of the airplane when you're getting on and getting ready to leave, you will see the ground crew. The ground crew got the huge airplane ready to fly. They check the tires, they put the bags on the plane, clean the windows, fill it with gas, do all of that stuff. These skilled workers make all the other things possible.
Right. Okay. Back to the article, and it says Off-Broadway became known for more experimental and less expensive shows than Broadway.
Interesting.
I think we're getting that idea now.
Yeah.
But we kind of need to know what experimental means, because what is experimental? So we often use experimental in the arts world. So it's used to describe a style or idea that hasn't been done before. So the term can be applied to many forms of arts, including music, cinema, or even things like paintings, traditional art.
Okay, so it's not pop.
No.
It's not the pop stuff. It's the slightly weirder stuff.
Right, so kind of almost the opposite of pop, really, isn't it? It's the stuff that people don't know, they haven't seen before.
But what's experimental today might be pop stuff in 10 years, right?
Exactly.
That's where new ideas come from.
Yes.
There you go, so that's good. And a lot of young actors who became famous later and young playwrights who became famous later, they started doing their interesting stuff right out of school. That was the experimental stuff that they might have played with earlier in their careers. It says you can find dozens of off-Broadway theaters near the Broadway district. We should point out that Broadway Avenue is an actual place in New York. You can find it on Google Maps. Off-Broadway is not, but it will be in the area of Broadway. But you won't find a street called Off-Broadway.
No. So if you go to New York, don't Google map.
Right. You would definitely, you would have much more success just writing in off-Broadway shows.
Right.
And then it'll give you a list. And on that list, you won't see things like Phantom of the Opera and Lion King. Now, another thing that's interesting about off-Broadway theaters is they're smaller. It says these have between 100 and 499 seats.
Right.
Remember, we learned yesterday that to be an official Broadway theater, it needs to be 500 seats or more.
Right.
So off-Broadway is 100, which is pretty small, up to 499. So just almost big enough to be a Broadway show.
And that number is quite big.
It's still a lot of people.
Size. Yeah. So we still couldn't get our 10 chairs around and call it an off-Broadway.
No, unfortunately not.
No. And the article then says, many playhouses that are now off-Broadway theatres used to be theatres for live vaudeville, and I think vaudeville,
Vaudeville, vaudeville,
and variety shows.
Wow, interesting.
Okay.
That was very popular entertainment 100 years ago.
Right.
Vaudeville would be tap dancing, juggling, comedies, people singing. Charlie Chaplin started off as a vaudeville performer.
Yes.
And many of the great silent movie stars did that. And variety shows. So this would have been really popular, common entertainment for your average person a long time ago, but these theaters were much smaller. Now they're used for experimental stuff, but they're still entertaining people. I like that.
Even today. So now it's time for today's grammar point. And this grammar point is quite easy to understand. Yay! It means that something that is how it is now was different in the past. It has changed. So I could say that I used to only write English for You articles, but now I teach them too. Or this building used to be a restaurant, but now it is a clothes store. It has changed from a restaurant to a clothes store. So we have the word vaudeville coming up. So we did mention that in the last sentence, but we kind of briefly discussed what that was. But let's find out, in a little bit more detail exactly what it was. So vaudeville was a type of theatre that was very popular in the US in the 20th century. So the vaudeville style is very light, with comedy and silly songs and dances performed throughout the play. So you mentioned Charlie Chaplin. I think that's probably a perfect example of the silly nature of that kind of play.
There you go. And it would be very entertaining for a huge group of people. I mean, I kind of think of some of those Taiwanese variety shows, right? Where you'll have animals doing tricks and then people maybe singing songs and then maybe some dancing. And it was good entertainment that would leave nobody bored. This is back before radio, back before television. So this is the kind of thing that anyone could afford to go to and they would get a few hours of fun entertainment. But as things changed, vaudeville kind of died off and a lot of the movie stars, or a lot of the vaudeville stars moved to Hollywood and became the first movie stars. But vaudeville theaters, it says, these faded because they couldn't compete with the new media of film and television. That's right. A lot of the vaudeville theaters became movie theaters if they had the money to, buy all the equipment, or a lot of them just closed down.
Started to die out.
Right. So vaudeville has faded. I'm sure you can still find people doing vaudeville today, but it's much less common than it would have been back in, 1900 or something like that. When things fade, they kind of go away over time. We often use this to talk about color. If you leave something hanging out in the sun for months and months, the color of that shirt will probably fade. It will go from a dark blue to a light blue. As the color kind of goes away, the color becomes weaker. But we can also use this to talk about how things will fade away. Sound fades, the sound of a truck as it drives away from you will get quieter and quieter over time. And, things that were popular 10, 20 years ago, they fade too. People do them less, use them less, you see them less frequently because times change and tastes change. For example, in the West, people's interest in traveling to China for a holiday has faded a bit over the last few years. I'm sure there are more people going to China in 2018 than there are now. Maybe it'll come back, but, it kind of fell off a little bit. We also had this word to compete. To compete is to play against and try to beat in some kind of competition. Of course, if you're playing a game, if you're playing chess, if you're playing computer games or a sport, you are competing against the other people. But we can also use this to talk about how businesses compete against each other. Students compete against each other to get better grades in class or something like that. And businesses will compete to get more money and get more customers.
Especially in the commercial world.
Exactly right. So movies are out there at the same time and they're competing to see who gets more money, who sells more tickets. We have an example sentence. Charlene is competing against hundreds of other people for a job at that famous company. Lots of people want the job, but there's only one person who will get it.
So good luck to Charlene.
Good luck to her.
So the article moves on to say the oldest off-Broadway theatre still operating is the Cherry Lane Theatre.
Wow, it's still open.
Apparently so.
Very cool.
So I don't know how old it is, but we might find out. I don't know.
Let's talk about this word operate. If something is operating, we're not talking about a doctor who's cutting your body open to fix the sick parts. That is to operate, but here we're not talking about that. We're talking about a business that is open, that is working, that has customers, it has staff, it's making money, it's open in the morning, it closes at night, it closes on Sundays. That business is working, it is functioning, it is operating. That's all we mean. For example, Zach's restaurant has been operating well for a few years, so he thinks now is a good time to take a vacation. And while he's away, I'm sure his business will continue to operate smoothly. All right, so we also learned yesterday how the Tony Awards are the big award for Broadway musicals.
Right, we did, yes.
And you can only get a Tony if you're in a Broadway musical. That's the big theaters on Broadway. But if you're in an off-Broadway show, don't worry. If you're really good in that show, you too can win an award. It just has a different name.
Not a Tony.
Not a Tony, unfortunately. It's an Obie. The Obie Awards honor the best off-Broadway plays and musicals. So these are maybe a little less famous than winning a Tony for a big Broadway show. But if you're in the acting world, I think anyone would be impressed with an Obie just as much as they would with a Tony.
Yes, and I imagine the famous shows are more likely to win these because they're famous for a reason,
It's true, and I guess if you win enough Obies off-Broadway, you might move on to Broadway a few years later and win Tonys later on.
Right, yeah. So what are a couple of famous off-Broadway shows?
We have a few that I think people might have heard of.
Okay, does the article tell us? Well, let's see. Two famous off-Broadway shows include Blue Man Group and I Love You, You're Perfect, Now Change.
Interesting. I mean, I've seen that being performed here. Okay. It's a really popular show here in Taiwan.
So even these off-Broadway shows, they make it around the world.
There you go. And they have local actors. They do it in Mandarin Chinese, but it started as an off-Broadway show. The Blue Man Group, they're famous. I think they've had a show in Las Vegas for many, many, many years. And they've been on television, been in the Olympics, I think, in the opening ceremonies. They've been a big success too. But they started off-Broadway, so there you go. And here's another interesting fact about an off-Broadway show. The longest running musical in theater history, The Fantastics, ran off-Broadway for over 42 years.
Wow, 42.
So you might think that off-Broadway is just for like weird experimental shows. Well, if you're doing a musical for 42 years, it's not that weird.
No.
A lot of people liked it.
Got to be successful.
Absolutely.
Sure.
That's amazing.
Yeah.
I think they had different cast.
Right, okay.
It's not the same actors for 42 years.
No, that would be a bit strange.
That would be mean. Those poor old people.
Unless they loved it.
Possibly.
Yeah. But do some make it to Broadway?
Absolutely, they do.
The article tells us, doesn't it? It says some popular off-Broadway shows later moved to Broadway. So there we go.
Yeah, absolutely. Some off-Broadway shows move to Broadway and then become movies like these ones. These include Grease, A Chorus Line, Rent, and Hamilton, which is probably one of the most popular shows on Broadway right now. Hamilton. It's also a movie, but it started off-Broadway. It started off-Broadway. We have a chat question for you coming up next.
For You Chat.
All right, our chat question is all about the type of show you might see off-Broadway.
Right, so what might you see or hear in an off-Broadway show that you wouldn't in a Broadway show? What do you think? It's a good question.
It's a hard question because I haven't seen a lot of off-Broadway shows, but going from the list that we saw there, like Blue Man Group, Grease, Hamilton, I think you might see shows that use more popular styles of music in the show, right? I mean, Phantom of the Opera, Lion King, that's kind of Broadway musical style music.
More musical, isn't
it?
Yes,
orchestra, they're playing things with strings. It might sound more modern than Beethoven, but it's similar to that kind of thing. Whereas Hamilton, that's hip hop. Grease used like 1950s Elvis style rock and roll.
Stuff that was popular back then.
Blue Man Group and maybe also Stomp, another one. They use a lot of just drumming. It's a lot of drumming and not a lot of singing and things like that.
So it's not traditional musical music.
Exactly. I think you would find more popular styles of music, and that's kind of a cool thing. If you want to do a heavy metal musical or something like that, you probably can off-Broadway, and then maybe eventually it will become popular. So I think that would be a fun thing about off-Broadway. If the traditional Broadway shows are a little boring to you, you can see something much more your style off-Broadway, no doubt. And now we're going to finish it up for today, but on day 3, tomorrow, we're going to take you off-Broadway, where things get really weird. So come back for that.
Vocabulary Review. Rejection. Jennifer always takes the rejection of her ideas personally, so it hurts her feelings. Cast. The producers of this movie spent lots of money on the cast, so it's full of famous actors. Crew. The TV station sent a news crew to the scene of a deadly train crash. Fade. The singer only really had one famous and popular album, and then she faded from public life. Compete. The brothers competed against each other when they were younger, but now they're good friends. Operate. Lots of small shops operate on this street, so this area is always full of shoppers.
智慧小补帖。
Playwright. Experimental. Vaudeville. Vaudeville.
以上节目是由活用空中美语制作，活用空中美语杂志，请洽询全国各大书店。如欲索取试听教材，请来电02-2364-4000 02-2364-4000，或上网查询，网址是 www.english4u.net www.english4u.net